for an old Indian trick I'm going to show you later. Right here we have the grave of Jefferson R. Smith, otherwise known as Soapy Smith. He was a con man and a criminal. He was only here 9 months, but he was the most powerful man in all of Alaska at that time. He had a gang of criminals that worked for him that numbered 300. Every crime those fellows committed, he got a commission. On the 4th of July, 4 days before he was killed, he was the Grand Marshal of the Skagway 4th of July parade. Now today that sounds funny, but back then, between 10 and 20,000 people lived in Skagway. It was the largest city in Alaska. The tents and shacks went way past the cemetery. The cemetery was almost in the center of town. Soapy was up the front of the parade on a big horse. He was followed by the public officials, including the law enforcement people. All of those public officials were on Soapy's payroll. Even the territorial governor of Alaska was in attendance on that 4th of July, and he was hanging out with Soapy. Everyone sought Soapy's favor back then because if you didn't, something really bad might happen to you. He was almost like the Mafia Don of Skagway, a seemingly popular guy. But 4 days later, when Soapy was killed, only 3 people came to Soapy's funeral. One of those people was the wagon driver that brought his body from the morgue up there to the cemetery. The second person was the minister who read the sermon, and the sermon was quite short. It went like this: "The way of the transgressor is hard. Amen." The third person was a mysterious lady with a black veil over her face. No one ever found out who that lady was. They did not even bury Soapy inside the official limits of the cemetery. The official limits start by the gray grave down there and run right along a line past us here, past the Japanese unknown to the other unknown graves up there. Soapy's way over here, so his remains won't desecrate the remains of the good people of Skagway. That's how the people really felt about Soapy once they weren't afraid to express themselves. Now, after Soapy was killed, the merchants formed a vigilante committee and they went into Soapy's apartment. There they found the bag of gold that belonged to Mr. Stewart. Only $2,100 worth of gold remained in the bag, but Stewart was quite happy to get that back. The $600 that was missing, they figure Soapy used that to pay the thief and the cover-up men. They also arrested as many of Soapy's gang members as they could capture. They held the worst 20 for trial, but let the rest of the gang go, but they banished those fellas from Skagway forever. And Skagway then became a law-abiding community, and it remains so today. Now, most of the people who died here during the gold rush didn't die from gunplay. They died from disease. All those thousands of people lived here, and there was no sanitation in the city we're talking about. So disease spread very quickly. The worst disease to hit was spinal meningitis in 1898. Now, this is also a very small cemetery for a city of that size, and the reason for that is that most of the people who died here are not actually buried here. Their bodies were shipped back to be buried with their families wherever they came from originally. There was a fellow in town who specialized in building shipping coffins for just that purpose, and believe it or not, that fellow's name was Mr. Peoples. Let's go over here and we'll see Frank Reed's grave. Notice many of these people are quite young. That's mostly because mostly young people came up here during the gold rush. Right here we have the grave of Mr. Frank Reed. He was considered a hero by the townspeople because he got rid of Soapy and his gang. Hundreds of people came to Mr. Reed's funeral. The people were really happy that he accomplished that deed. The merchants were especially grateful to Mr. Reed because he saved their businesses for them. So they chipped in and built him this beautiful grave, which is better than everything else in the whole cemetery. They etched on his stone that he gave his life for the honor of Skagway. Later on, I'll tell you a story about the honor of Mr. Reed I think you'll find funny. He was 54 years old, older than most people that came up for the gold rush. Most of the people that came for the gold rush were under 40. People over 40 generally would stay home where it was nice and warm. But there's a fellow in back up there next to the big tree named Frederick Allen. And Mr. Allen's wooden grave marker is nice and new looking. And that's because they replaced the wooden grave markers in this cemetery as they age. If the wooden grave markers were ever all destroyed by vandals or by forest fire, they could all be replaced from the photograph collection of Mr. Eric Hegg. His pictorial history of the Gold Rush era was so complete. And notice on the wooden grave markers it has the person's name and the date they died, but not the date they were born. That's because nobody knew these folks well enough to know their birth date. Usually those wooden grave markers marked the graves of poor people, and they were generally paid for by passing the hat in the saloon. There were fences around some of the graves that were put there by the families when they used to tend the graves on a regular basis to protect the floral arrangements the families put on the graves. They stopped using this cemetery in 1906 and started to use a new one on the other side of town, which we will see later on today. But anybody who was a Gold Rush veteran was entitled to be buried in this cemetery no matter when they died. So some people were buried here long after 1906. People ask me why'd they pick such a stony spot for a cemetery. Well, believe it or not, this is one of the few places in Skagway you could actually dig deep enough to bury people. In most of Skagway, the dirt's only about that deep. You couldn't bury a squirrel in that. And that's because of a glacier that came through 25,000 years ago and carved out this pass by cutting through the granite in these mountains. It also took all the topsoil with it when it left. So we're going to head back to the bus now, and I'll tell you some more stories about Soapy.